Hello, everyone. We're looking at the first reading from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. I want to reiterate that these videos are not meant to be authoritative. I don't think that there's any book that we're reading for this class on which I could, in the least bit, claim any authority. They're things that I've read, but not really closely until now. And I'm just sharing my thoughts with you in these videos. I try to keep the reading exams as factual in terms of just being familiar with the text as possible, and offer my opinions and thoughts in these videos just as a way of just sharing with you the kind of things that you share with me on the discussion board for the readings. The section that we've read for this reading is called On Violence. If you're my age, and I'm 56 years old, and growing up in the 70s and 80s, basically post-war period, I was a young person who definitely watched the news and read the newspapers and read books on contemporary politics and history. So one of the things that I took for granted in that world is that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, historical process of my time, which is again that sort of latter part of the post-war period, 70s and 80s, is the end of colonialism and what really happened before my time, the wars of liberation, the anti-colonial wars, especially in Africa. This is just a huge part of the world in my time. And so I mention that because this is so written around 1960. This is so situated in that historical process of decolonization that it may not be something that you know much about. And I'm not the person. I'm not an historian. My knowledge of liberation movements and decolonizations is still layman's knowledge, but that background is pretty, I think, important for understanding Fanon. He is from Martinique, which is a French possession, an island. I'm not really sure where Martinique is, but it's a French possession, and he was involved in the war in Algeria, the War of Resistance. Algeria, the North African country, that was a huge French possession and important part of the French colonial empire. And I think that his experience is a particularly French experience, French colonialism, but certainly there are other forms. Other countries had huge empires. Of course, the British, but also the Dutch and the Portuguese, especially in Asia and Africa. And so his book is not meant to be particularly French, about the French colonial empire, but I think that that's what he knows best. But certainly when he talks about colonialism, imperialism, he's talking about that process of the liberation and sort of disassembly of the great European uh, colonial empires and what it means. He's trying to give us a theory of that. And this is called On Violence. And I don't know what to say about that, except that I don't think that I would say that Fanon is pro-violence. I think what his point is that there's no getting away from violence when it comes to decolonization, and that is not something that I expect everyone to agree with. I'm not even sure I agree with that. But one of the um, things about that is, he's talking about violent resistance and violent confrontation with colonialism and violent liberation movements within the European colonies. But one of the first things that he says, and I'm not sure exactly where it is that the real spokesperson of the colonists, of basically the European countries that have taken these lands, the real spokesperson is the soldier and the policeman. That they are the ones who are the most important in terms of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and that relationship is one of violence. That is, these colonies were violently taken and they are violently maintained by the European powers. So, against that backdrop, the notion that violence would be necessary in order to liberate these colonies, to end colonialism, perhaps is more obvious. Which is not to say that there aren't other models. Certainly, the model in India, at least with Gandhi, of nonviolent resistance, which is something that Fanon just absolutely rejects, it seems to me. Um, Although he doesn't talk about India. India, he wrote this in around 1960, and of course, India became an independent country in 1947 or 48, maybe 47. And it was not as a result of a long, violent liberation movement, which is not to say that the British didn't use violence to maintain their power in India. It just was that um, the thing didn't end, at least in any obvious way, as a result of violent resistance on the part of the colonized in India. It ended for other reasons. But Fanon does not take that into account. He figures that violence is inevitable. I don't know. That's one of the things I'd like to hear more from you about, is whether you believe that violence is justified and inevitable. Um, this is I think, extremely interesting text, and when it's a raw text. Again, that word shows up, and that word shows up, that hate word against black people, written by a black man, certainly not an American black man, black man, and written because one of the realities, probably the reality, that is in place here is race. Um, he uses the term Manichaeism. That's an old Christian heresy, the idea that the universe is divided up between forces of good and evil, and that these two sides are fighting it out. For Fanon, there's two sides and only two sides, and they will fight it out in the colonial situation, the colonizer and the colonized. And that division, or what he calls the compartmentalization of the colony, is according to race. The white Europeans and the people of color, the darker peoples in Africa and Asia. The compartmentalized world, the world, he says, divided into, inhabited by different species. Now, I don't know how to take that, really. I certainly don't think that he means in any serious way that these two peoples are different biological species. But as a result of the taking of colonies and the maintenance of them by force and all of the ideology that is behind it, they may as well be two different species. They're so absolutely divided. There's no sense of rapprochement here. This is not a book that wants people to join hands and become brothers and sisters. This is a book about hatred and revenge and establishing one's place in the world through violence. This is exactly what it is, and maybe he's right. You know, I mean, for every place like India, which was, again, the British didn't leave in any obvious way because of violent resistance, but every place like that where colonization ends, um, there are many more places with armed resistance. And where I've been talking about the French and the British, um, and the Portuguese and the Dutch. Portuguese were in different places, especially in Africa, especially in a place called Angola. The Dutch, I think their major possession was in what used to be called the East Indies, which is now Indonesia. And it's interesting that these fairly small European countries had such vast empires, but that's a long story, I guess. I've been talking about these European countries, but certainly I think Fanon would regard the United States of America as a colonizer. It's just that it doesn't have the kind of vast empire along the lines of the French and the British. Certainly, um, places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, yeah. But when the Europeans were taking these parts of the world and basically stealing them, saying they owned them, the United States was engaged in its own imperial conquest, and that was the Empire of North America, you know, which is taken from the indigenous peoples of North America and Mexico, and place. So I mean, and the backdrop of the United States intervention in different places. The Vietnam War has not happened yet, but I don't think Fanon would be surprised by it. Not that the United States wanted to colonize South Vietnam, but it certainly was a similar thing going on in the Vietnam War. In any case, it's complicated, isn't it?